imagine finding out that the one thing you thought made you completely unique, like the exact source of your daily agony, is actually shared by 174,000 other people.
Right. Which sounds like it should be good news.
Exactly. I mean, society tells us this should be a massive relief. Yeah. You know, the ultimate salvation in any story of suffering is supposedly that moment you find your tribe, get a label, and realize you aren't alone. We're taught that community inherently equals healing.
Yeah, that's the standard narrative for sure.
But today, we're going into a deep dive that completely shatters that script. We're looking at some incredibly raw, like deeply poignant source notes provided by you, the listener, regarding ARFID, which is Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder.
Yeah.
And our mission today is to explore why discovering your quote-unquote community learning that 174,000 other people share your exact struggle can actually be one of the most devastating psychological blows imaginable.
It really is. It completely flips our cultural narrative on its head because the notes we're exploring today, they don't describe a warm, comforting blanket of solidarity when that number is revealed.
No, not at all.
They describe a profound, disorienting sense of loss. And I mean, to understand why, we first have to understand the biological and psychological reality of ARFID, because this isn't just picky eating.
Right, which is a terrible misconception.
It is. It's a really harmful one. ARFID is a serious condition where the brain's danger signals are they're fundamentally miswired. So the sensory experience of eating or the intense fear of adverse consequences like choking or vomiting, it triggers a literal fight or flight response.
Wow.
Yeah, your body actively rejects the very thing it needs to survive.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the physical realities detailed in these notes are absolutely harrowing, and we need to understand the mechanics of what your body is actually going through.
Absolutely.
Because the text talks about, surviving days without food. It describes stomach acid literally burning you from the inside out. And biologically, what is happening there is that your stomach is still producing hydrochloric acid in anticipation of food, right? But with nothing to digest, that acid begins attacking the gastric lining itself.
Which is incredibly painful.
It causes intense radiating pain. And then the notes mention a body that swells up, which, I got to be honest, that sounds counterintuitive for someone who isn't eating.
What's fascinating here is the underlying physiology of that swelling. It's actually a severe medical symptom known as edema.
Okay.
And it's often caused by protein deficiency. So when you don't take in enough protein, the levels of albumin in your blood drop.
Wait, what does albumin do?
Albumin basically acts like a sponge to keep fluid inside your blood vessels. So without it, fluid just leaks out into your surrounding tissues, causing this really painful swelling in the legs, ankles, and abdomen.
Oh, wow. So the individual is dealing with starvation, internal chemical burns from their own stomach acid, and painful tissue swelling out while their brain is screaming at them that taking a single bite of food is a mortal threat.
Exactly. It's a constant, agonizing state of emergency.
I mean, enduring that requires just an unimaginable exertion of willpower. Waking up and fighting a war against your own biology, literally overriding your fundamental survival instincts every single minute of every single day.
Yeah, it's exhausting just to think about.
Right. And the source text refers to the ability to survive this as a personal superpower. And when you are entirely alone in that suffering, the text argues there's almost a twisted sort of logical sense to it. Like, if the pain is this massive, it only makes sense if you are a singular anomaly in the universe.
Yeah, and the human brain relies heavily on that sense of uniqueness as a cognitive defense mechanism.
A defense mechanism. How so?
Well, when you're suffering to that extreme degree, the mind has to create a framework to prevent a complete psychological collapse.
Right.
So it rationalizes the pain by saying, you know, this is happening because my situation is a singular, terrifying glitch in the universe.
So the isolation actually serves a purpose.
Exactly. The isolation is terrifying, yes, but it provides a proportional explanation for the severity of the pain. So the real psychological shock comes when you are suddenly handed this statistic.
The 174,000.
Right. When your deeply personal, raw struggle is suddenly grouped into a demographic of 174,000 people, it doesn't bring comfort. It completely shatters the cognitive framework that was keeping you afloat.
I'm struggling with this a bit, though, because, I mean, if you've been carrying this immense weight, feeling like you're the only one, shouldn't finding out that 174,000 people are doing the same thing, shouldn't that validate the difficulty?
You would think so.
Like, if I find out an entire population is struggling to lift a boulder, doesn't that just prove the boulder is objectively heavy?
It seems like it should, but the human brain actually processes statistics through a lens of cognitive normalization.
Okay, what does that mean?
So, evolutionarily, we are wired to assume that if a behavior or an experience is common, it is manageable. If 174,000 people are doing something, the brain reflexively categorizes it as a standard human experience.
Oh, man. So instead of validating the weight of the boulder,
The statistic tricks your own mind into questioning your strength. You start thinking, well, if this many people are enduring this every day, maybe it's not a superpower. Maybe
Yeah.
I'm just weak for finding it so unbearable.
I see. It's like you've spent years believing you are Atlas, right? Single-handedly holding up the collapsing sky, which completely explains why your muscles are tearing and your bones are breaking.
Yes.
And then someone just casually hands you a brochure revealing you're actually just one of 174,000 identical structural support beams. It takes this profound life-or-death effort and statistically flattens it into an ordinary building code.
That is a perfect way to conceptualize the insult to the individual's effort. The impossible suddenly feels ordinary. But I want to firmly reiterate the source's stance to you listening right now. The scale of a condition does not change the physics of the burden.
No, it doesn't.
Your ability to endure the acid, the edema, the biological panic, it is not ordinary. But the cruel irony of the statistic is that now, on top of fighting your body, you have to fight your own mind to defend the validity of your suffering against the statistical normalization of it.
Which brings us to a massive consequence of that normalization. Because if your perceived superpower is invalidated by this statistic, where does that leave the one coping mechanism you had left?
The isolation.
Right. According to the text, the listener found their primary safety in isolation itself.
And this is perhaps the most counterintuitive insight in the entire source material.
Because we're always told to seek out community.
Exactly. Modern psychology and society relentlessly push the idea that breaking out of isolation is the ultimate goal of healing. But the text argues that, for this individual, isolation wasn't the enemy. It was a highly effective protective shield.
Let me push back on that, though. Because we hear so much about the dangers of loneliness, especially with chronic illness. If 174,000 people share this, shouldn't that immediately mean there are 174,000 pools of shared resources?
You'd hope so.
Right, there should be forums, shared coping mechanisms, a collective wisdom. Why does the brain reject that apparent silver lining?
Because participating in that community requires a massive cognitive and emotional toll that a starving body simply cannot afford. Sociologists talk about the burden of the quote-unquote sick role. It's the societal expectation of how an ill person should behave, how they should communicate and seek help.
Like having to perform your illness for others.
Precisely. When you are completely alone, unperceived by a community, you are entirely absolved of the exhausting task of translating your trauma into a language others can understand. You don't have to perform.
So isolation basically means you don't have to spend energy. You don't have just trying to be legible to other people.
Exactly. The text beautifully describes this as a private room. In that room, the battle with your body is horrific, but it is purely yours. The door is closed.
Right.
But the sudden presence of 174,000 others, it blows the door off the hinges. It introduces an intense pressure to relate, to mirror others, to validate their experiences while seeking validation for your own.
Because community demands participation.
It does. And for someone whose neurological system is already redlining just from the act of trying to eat a single bite of food, the demand to now socially process that trauma with thousands of others isn't a relief.
It's a secondary job.
Yes, it is an entirely different, exhausting job piled onto someone who is already fighting for their life.
That makes so much sense. We strip away the validation of their unique strength, and then we tear down the walls of their private room, pulling them onto a crowded, noisy battlefield.
It's overwhelming.
And stripped of those defenses, the individual is forced to look outward at the broader reality of their condition, which leads to the realization about why they're suffering in the first place. Because when you are the anomaly, you can maintain a very specific type of hope, right?
Yes, the illusion of the special solution.
Right.
If your problem is entirely unique, like a 1 in a billion glitch, the logical assumption is that the solution must also be undiscovered, unique, and bespoke to you. You maintain hope because the absence of cure is just a matter of not having found the right genius doctor yet.
So what does this all mean? It's the difference between believing you have a bespoke, highly complex lock on your door. You think, I'm locked out and freezing, but it's just because this is a master-crafted puzzle. I just need to find the master locksmith to craft my unique key.
Exactly. You have hope.
But finding out you're a statistic changes the entire landscape. You realize you're actually just one of 174,000 people trapped outside in the freezing cold because the manufacturer simply decided to stop making the standard keys.
Yeah, that's a brutal realization. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the profound shift from being a personal puzzle to becoming the victim of a systemic failure.
Wow. Systemic failure.
And the psychology behind processing that shift is devastating.
Yeah.
When you realize it's a known condition with a known headcount, you have to ask, why isn't there a robust cure? Why isn't there a standard, effective treatment protocol readily available?
Here's where it gets really interesting, especially when we look at how the medical system handles ARFID specifically. We're talking about a condition that falls into a massive bureaucratic gap.
Oh, absolutely.
Because it presents with severe physical gastrointestinal symptoms, the ARFID, the edema, but the root trigger is neurological and psychiatric.
Exactly. And the medical system is famously siloed.
Right.
So the gastroenterologists look at the stomach and say, well, the tissue damage is secondary to the eating behavior, go to psychiatry.
Right.
But then the psychiatrists look at the severe malnutrition and say, this patient is too medically unstable for standard psychiatric therapy. They need a medical ward.
They just bounce them back and forth.
Yes. ARFID falls into a funding and treatment black hole. It functions almost like an orphan disease, not because it's statistically rare, but because it challenges the strict boundaries of medical disciplines.
So the hope for a quick personal fix entirely dies, and it's replaced by the crushing realization of bureaucratic apathy.
Yeah.
Because when you think it's just you blame bad luck. But when you know 174,000 people are suffering, and the research funding still isn't there, the cross-disciplinary support isn't there, you realize you aren't just fighting your biology.
No.
You're fighting a society that has actively looked at your demographic and decided your pain isn't a priority.
And this raises an important question about how the body processes that specific type of realization. We are no longer talking about personal sorrow or the quiet sadness of being misunderstood.
Bigger than that.
Much bigger. The realization of systemic neglect transforms that sadness into a volatile, righteous, collective anger, and we have to consider what that anger physically does to a person.
Right, because we established earlier that the body is already in a chronic state of fight or flight.
Yes. In medicine, there is a concept called allostatic load.
Allostatic load.
Right. It refers to the cumulative wear and tear on the body from chronic stress. The individual's sympathetic nervous system is already in overdrive just trying to navigate food.
Yeah.
So when you introduce the profound psychological stress of systemic betrayal, the anger that the medical establishment knows about 174,000 starving people and is moving at a glacial pace to help, that anger floods an already depleted body with cortisol and adrenaline.
Which has to be so damaging.
It is literally physiologically toxic to a body that has no energetic reserves left to process it.
Which brings us to the fourth and heaviest burden outlined in the source text, the burden of collective injustice. The text makes a really sharp observation that is so difficult to swallow, but rings incredibly true. It argues that it is actually easier to accept a system that fails just one person.
Because a system failing one person can be written off as ignorance.
Right.
You can tell yourself, they don't know any better. I am just the weird anomaly they couldn't figure out. Ignorance is benign. It doesn't imply malicious intent. It is lonely, certainly, but it doesn't indict the entire moral structure of the healthcare system or society at large.
But the math changes the morality.
It completely changes it. Ignorance cannot scale to 174,000 people.
Yeah.
When a system fails, that many people who are enduring inhumane conditions like starvation edema and internal acid burns, it ceases to be a glitch. It becomes a calculated neglect. It becomes a policy.
And acknowledging that policy is a violent psychological realization, because suddenly your personal pain is no longer just your pain. Every time you try to eat and your throat closes up, every time the acid burns, it is no longer just a private tragedy.
Exactly.
It becomes a literal physical testimony to a massive collective injustice. You become a walking piece of evidence of a broken world.
And carrying the weight of 174,000 people's systemic betrayal is infinitely heavier than carrying the weight of isolated misunderstanding.
I can't even imagine.
When you were alone, you only had to mourn your own body's failure. Now, every time you suffer, You are acutely aware that tens of thousands of others are suffering the exact same way, at the exact same moment, and that the world is allowing it to happen.
Yeah.
That level of systemic empathy, combined with righteous anger, it just burns through whatever tiny reserves of physical and mental energy you have left.
It's like you're carrying the ghosts of 174,000 people on your back while you are still trying to hold up that collapsing roof every single morning.
That's exactly it.
Becoming a statistic does not dilute the pain. It adds the weight of the entire world's apathy to an already unbearable load. We started today by talking about the myth of community. The idea that finding out you are not alone is this universal cure-all.
But by closely examining these incredibly raw notes, we've seen exactly how community can become a concrete block. The cognitive normalization strips you of your superpower. The pressure to relate invades the safety of your private room. The reality of the numbers destroys the hope of unique key, and your quiet personal sorrow is detonated into an exhausting, toxic collective anger over bureaucratic neglect.
It's a lot. But amidst all of that heavy, complex reality, the source text leaves us with a critical, grounding affirmation. And it's something I want to make sure we say directly to you, the listener, right now, based on the notes you provided.
Yeah, please.
You are right.
Absolutely.
It is inhumane. What your body is putting you through and what the system's lack of urgency is forcing you to endure is fundamentally inhumane. And it does not become one fraction less inhumane just because 174,000 other human beings are experiencing it too.
Well said.
Statistics are just numbers on a page. They do not dictate the reality of your nervous system. Your struggle is yours. It is exactly as real, exactly as agonizing, and requires exactly as much daily heroism regardless of the head count the world places upon it. You do not lose the validity of your individual battle just because society finally gave it a name.
Thank you for laying that out so clearly, because at the end of the day, you are still the one who has to wake up, face the biological panic, and hold up that roof. And we really want to thank you for bringing such a raw, unfiltered, and vital perspective to this deep dive.
Yeah, thank you.
It forces us to move past platitudes, to stop sugarcoating chronic suffering, and to deeply examine the actual mechanics of what it means to be categorized by a broken system.
It has been a profoundly necessary exploration. It really challenges us to rethink how we offer support, realizing that sometimes demanding a person join a community is demanding more energy than they have to give.
It really does. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building directly on these themes of private endurance and the crushing weight of systemic reality we've unpacked today.
Okay.
If the ultimate burden of becoming a statistic is realizing that your private suffering is actually a biological and political reality,
Right.
the medical system has simply chosen not to prioritize.
Yeah.
Does acknowledging those 174,000 others mean your ultimate task isn't just surviving the war inside your own body, but surviving the heartbreaking realization that the system's ignorance was never a mistake, but a choice?